Now let's take a look at Paul's theology in Romans. First of all, we're going to begin with the major feature, which is Paul's thinking about the law, that is the law of Moses. There are certainly several different places where Paul describes the law in kind of negative terms or negative view, as the law is something that kind of incites sin, and that we come to know sin and experience sin because of the law. But Paul also does have some positive views about the law, and that the law is holy and the law is righteous. Of course, the law has to be holy and righteous because it does come from God. The law doesn't originate with Moses, though we sometimes call it the Mosaic law, but Moses is only the mediator of the law. The law is actually God's, so one can't say that the law is ever bad or unholy or evil. Maybe the way in which people understand the law or apply the law can be bad or evil, but not the law itself. As I mentioned, Torah does give humans the opportunity to increase in sin, and in Romans chapter 7, Paul kind of projects the mind of someone who is dealing with what the obedience to the law does to them. That is, that they become aware of sin because of the law, and also then their desire for that sin is also enticed. So the question oftentimes is whether or not Romans chapter 7 is a reflection actually of Paul's own mind, and that this is Paul's struggle. And then people wonder, well, is this Paul's struggle before he became a Christian? Is this Paul's struggle after he became a Christian? In my own view, I don't think that this really sounds like Paul. When we look at the book of Philippians, Philippians describes himself as blameless towards the law, and so he didn't really have a kind of a struggle with the law as indicated in this chapter 7. So others have seen this as kind of a personification activity, that Paul is personifying what a Jew ought to be thinking when they look at the law. Not actually what they might or do think, but if they had a correct understanding of the law, this is how they ought to they would be expressing that internal conflict with the law. The Torah is seen as a hindrance to Gentiles accepting the Gospels, and in one part, not the law itself, but the way in which the law is presented to the Gentiles by certain Jewish Christians who see law observance as mandatory, as required for the Gentiles. And of course, the Gentiles see several things in the Jewish law that are kind of anathema to them, or things that they would not want to participate in, such as circumcision, maybe food laws, or Sabbath observance, and that if the God of the universe is tied to these particular expressions of Judaism, that may be a difficulty in believing that this God is interested in them. So Paul sees the insistence by certain Jewish Christians to observe the law as a problem. Now, a key idea, both in the letter to the Romans and in the letter to the Galatians, is the concept of the works of the law. And by works of the law, what Paul particularly means is those laws that help to make a Jew distinctive from Gentiles. So circumcision is distinctive, those Sabbath observances are distinctive. There's a lot of things that are works of the law that Paul would consider that Gentiles still must observe, such as, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not commit adultery. So there are lots of things that are still in the law, but Paul is not really thinking about those. He's thinking about things that a Jew might consider needs to be done in order to show oneself distinctive from the pagan world. Also, human righteousness is an interesting issue in Romans. Paul does think that humans can be righteous, can do righteous things, There is a statement that Paul recognizes all human beings have failed to live righteously in a perfect way, except for Jesus Christ, and that their inability to be fully and completely righteous leads them in need of God's justification, or for God's some type of redemptive or reconciliation activity. So God is going to deal with the problem of humans not being able to be completely righteous. But humans can do things that are righteous, and they can live in ways that are righteous. Another problem with the law is that it has been used for Jewish boasting, or what he sees as Jewish boasting. That yes, the law is a good thing, and yes, the law was something that was given to the Jews, and yes, Paul sees it as a beautiful thing, and yet because Jews take such pride in Torah, it was actually a thing that was preventing the expansion of the Gospels to Gentiles. And so as a basis of Jewish boasting, Paul saw the law as a problem. Paul also talks about in Romans 10:4 that Jesus is the end, the telos, that's the Greek word, of the law. And so what does Paul mean by this? Well, the word telos can mean the end in the sense of the completion of something. And so some have understood that what this means is that the law has ended, or observance of the law has ended once Jesus has arrived. But that's unlikely to be what Paul has in mind. Paul continues to see law observance by Jewish Christians as something that will still continue on. Paul never tells any Jewish Christian, stop obeying the law. That would be a very odd thing to say, since the law comes from God and they receive it as God, and so observing what God has given to them would be seen as a sign of obedience for them to the covenant with Abraham. So it's unlikely that Paul thought, okay, since Jesus came, no Jew ought to be obeying the law. But what he means is the word telos can also have the idea of as the goal, that the end. And so what the law wants to do is its goal is to make people righteous in relationship to the covenant with Abraham. That is now completed by Christ. So the law wants to make Jews righteous. Of course, Jews fail to be righteous because there's still this issue of sin in their lives, and it's preventing them from being completely righteous because of that struggle with sin. But now, because of Jesus Christ, human beings are, both Jew and Gentile, are able to be made righteous in the way that the law wanted to make Jewish people righteous. So in that sense, Jesus is the end. He is the goal that the law had. His presence helps people to achieve that goal. Now, another major feature in Romans is the concept of the righteousness of God. The gospel is the revelation of God's righteousness, and those who are righteous live by faith, kind of as well a special reading of Habakkuk 2:4. But what does this expression really mean? Were we talking about some kind of objective righteousness, that is, something that God gives us? Or are we talking about something subjective, that is, having to do with God's character? Are we talking about the righteousness which comes from God to us, or the righteousness which God himself has? Or is it really both? The righteousness of God stands alongside God's wrath, which too is already being revealed. And this wrath of God is primarily directed towards idolatry. Idolatry is the big number one sin. And so because of God's character, God cannot tolerate idolatry. And so he punishes idolatry, he responds to idolatry. And because God is righteous, this subjective understanding he also shows no partiality to those who commit sin. Sin, thinking of this kind of embodiment of that which resists God, that rebels against God. So this is just a little bit of insight into the way in which righteousness of God is used in Romans. I would again turn your attention to the writing in De Silva about the righteousness of God, and make sure you're familiar with that concept. So we'll leave that right now as two aspects of Paul's theology in Romans.